Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. Maybe don't wait for a vaccine. You could already have immunity. With many illnesses, you may have no chance of catching them again, as you might know, because of the defenses your body acquired first time around. Is the same true with COVID-19? This is Roundtable. And even if there is eventually a vaccine, how long will it last? Is it possible we will never escape from this coronavirus? That we will just have to learn to live with it?
Millions of people have been infected with coronavirus since the pandemic began more than 6 months ago. Just like other viruses, the best way of stopping COVID-19 would be achieving immunity. But it's far from straightforward. Billions of dollars are being spent on developing a vaccine that might never arrive. We can also get natural immunity by contracting the virus, but for many people, the risk of long-term effects or death is high. Vaccination and natural immunity both contribute to herd immunity. This is when enough people have immunity from a virus that others who are not immune become unlikely to catch it. One group of scientists say we need at least a 60% herd immunity level to prevent future outbreaks from spreading. But there's still doubt about how long immunity from COVID-19 will last. According to a study by King's College London, 60% of patients produced a potent antibody response to the virus, but only 17% retained the same potency after 3 months. So how confident can we be of getting long-term protection from COVID-19?
I'm very pleased to welcome Gisli Jenkins to the show. He's a professor at the National Institute for Health Research and joint editor-in-chief of the respiratory journal Thorax. We say hello to Gabriela Gomes, professor of mathematics and statistics at Strathclyde University, currently in Portugal, and David Strain, senior clinical lecturer at the University of Exeter Medical School. Good to have you on. Gabriela, you've got some fairly controversial ideas, but we'll go to David first to point out how you get immunity. It would be a wonderful thing if we all got it. How does that happen?
So when your body is exposed to anything, in this case, we're talking about the virus, it generates an immune reaction, and those immune reaction produces antibodies. They're produced by cells within our body, and once the cells are programmed to respond, then the idea is that those cells will always respond as soon as they're exposed to that virus. So the idea here would be that if you've had COVID once, you will generate long-term antibodies, and then the next time COVID comes anywhere near you, you'll respond with the antibodies immediately, hopefully stopping it infecting you and stopping you developing disease.
And the reason why you need a flu jab if you have one every year, or you can keep getting it even if you've had it once, is because there are different strains of flu?
Absolutely. I mean, all viruses mutate on a very regular basis. We've seen some mutations going on with COVID, so that we've got several different serotypes of COVID already. And we need to update our vaccinations on a regular basis, because as the virus changes, so too does its ability to infect us. If you've got infected by flu 1 year, you can be infected by a different strain of flu the following year.
Okay, herd immunity, your thoughts on that? Because then we're going to Gabrielle, who's got some thoughts on it.
Well, the point of herd immunity is if you get between 60 and 70%, most people suggest, of the population is immune to a condition, that means that the virus itself doesn't have a host to transmit amongst us. So if 60 to 70% of the population is immune, when we get exposed to it, we don't catch it, we don't spread it on, and therefore the population as a whole is protected by that number that's got the immunity already.
Gabriela, mathematician, immunity, a wonderful thing. You say 10% for herd immunity is possible.
Yeah, we find that between 10 and 20%, depending on the country, depending on even regions within a country, would be sufficient to have a population with herd immunity. And in fact, we say that based on mathematical models. I have to confess that it was very surprising to me that our results were taken as controversial, because I think it's very intuitive. So our models differ from the more classical mathematical epidemiology models that most groups are developing, in that they take into account individual variation in susceptibility or exposure to infection. So in our model, some individuals are more susceptible than others. It could be due to their innate immune system. It could be their general health status or genetics or whatever biological reason could make one individual more susceptible than another, or exposure to other coronaviruses or things like that. That could make individuals differ in their susceptibility to this new coronavirus, or it could be exposure. Some individuals meet more people in their everyday life than others, and if they meet more people, they are more exposed.
Why don't I take a bit of a back seat here and leave it to the two clinical experts who are looking slightly quizzical about what you've said, to pose their questions to you, because they know more about the subject than I do. Gisli, I'll start with you. What do you want to ask Gabriela?
Well, I guess the question is, when we think about herd immunity, we always threshold it. So it's either you have herd immunity or you don't have herd immunity. What I'm hearing from Gabriela, which may make some sense, is that there are levels of protection of the population. Once you hit 60, you may get no further infections, but you might get a reduction in the level of infection if you only have 10% of the population infected. Is that the sort of model you're suggesting?
No, we actually mean the thresholds being lower than 60%. And the way I think the way the logic goes is that if you have an individual where individuals are not equally susceptible or equally exposed, the individuals that are going to be infected first and become immune first are those individuals who were more susceptible or more exposed to begin with. So there is a kind of selection, there's a kind of a natural selection process here. So once these individuals who were originally more susceptible or more exposed become immune, they are removed from the susceptible pool. So the susceptible pool is now composed of the individuals who were originally less susceptible or less exposed.
Yeah.
So the average susceptibility of the population that is available to the virus is a population whose composition makes them less and less susceptible.
So can I come at this from a slightly different angle, Gabriel, if I may? Do you believe that some people may have a high level of immunity naturally, you said innate, without ever having gone near the virus?
It doesn't have to be full immunity. We just consider that instead of having a model that makes an approximation that makes all individuals equally susceptible, we don't make that approximation. We accept that the susceptibility is a distribution. It is according to some distribution that does not, and some individuals are at the high susceptibility end of this distribution.
David's biting his tongue. Go on.
There's a couple of assumptions that I would be really interesting to know how you've made those assumptions. When it comes to stability, for example, I mean, I've been very involved in creating the risk scores that we're using throughout the NHS at the moment with the British Medical Association. And even we don't know the full risk factors for this condition. We've had such an excellent shielding program. Some conditions that were highly susceptible for flu in the past, for example, don't appear to be particularly high risk here, and that's purely because we've done such a good job of shielding them. So I'd really like to know how you calculated your susceptibility. And then the second thing that I'm really interested in is you've based a lot of this on behavioral modeling. Does that mean that the behavioral modeling is on our current lockdown or physical distancing, or do you believe this herd immunity at 10% is still going to be effective when life returns to normal? Because I mean, that's what we are ultimately aiming for. And without those two elements, without knowing those two elements.
Okay, well, we'll get Gabriela to give us the answer.
Yeah, you just asked very big questions all packed together. So
You might have to write to him later, give more detail.
I'll try to unpack.
Try and keep it simple for us.
Okay, so the first one is, how do we assess susceptibility? How do we know that one individual is more susceptible than another? What are the factors that make that? So the short answer is, we don't know. And the way we build our model, we don't need to know that. So let me compare this measurement of susceptibility with measurement of this R number, the basic reproduction number. When we say that the basic reproduction number is the average number of secondary infections caused by an infected individual during their entire infectious period. So to estimate this number, these are not, so this basic reproduction number, what we usually do is not to go and measure directly how many individuals each individual infected and do that for many, many individuals and then calculate the average. That's not how it's done. We have a model that has this R0 as a parameter, and we fit this model is a transmission model. Its output is an epidemic curve. So for different values of R0, we generate different epidemic curves. But there is a particular value of R0 that produces the epidemic curve that is most similar to the data. So that's how we estimate R0 in most cases.
If the second answer is going to take as long as that, and I appreciate it is very detailed, I'm going to have to ask you to communicate a little bit later on that subject, because there's other areas that you've spoken about, Gabriela, that I'd like to go into. Let me put this to Gisli. Gabriela has suggested there is no or little evidence of reinfection.
Well, I think at the moment that's true, but we're only 4 months in. And if you look at the SARS epidemic of 2003, the immunity lasted for about 2 years.
So you can't draw any conclusion from that?
Well, I think we have to wait until we see what happens in 2 years. There may well be continuing community spread at low level, and then in 2 years, when our immunity wanes to SARS-CoV-2, if indeed that's what happens, then there may well be reinfection. We just can't say with any certainty because we are only 4 months in.
Gabriela, what do you make of your suggestion, or
Yeah,
how do you explain your suggestion that 4 European countries, Belgium, England, Portugal and Spain, have surpassed the risk of countrywide second waves? In other words, there won't be this peak that we've seen already again.
Yeah, we actually, in our second paper, the one you are referring to, we actually consider reinfection as well. So we do our basic analysis without reinfection, and then we do a sensitivity analysis where we allow some level of reinfection happening. And we see that in those 4 countries, so we see for Portugal, for example, we expect a herd immunity threshold about 10%. For England, we estimate a herd immunity threshold of 20%. Spain and Belgium are between those two. And it's not just a herd immunity threshold. We expect still outbreaks throughout the rest of this year.
So these aren't second waves, these are localized outbreaks that we're seeing perhaps in Belgium and Spain?
I think they would be more like localized outbreaks. I don't think there is enough susceptibility anymore to fuel a very large growth like
David, if this is the case, it would be good news.
It would be good news, and don't get me wrong, I really hope that Gabrielle is right. But I do worry that the distribution we've had in England has been very different to what we saw in Spain. Spain from the outset had very focused centres, as did Italy. Within the UK, we had around 12 to 13,000 individual entry points, and the COVID was spread pretty uniformly across the whole country. Whereas as Gabrielle points out, there are parts of Spain that are now protected because they probably are above a threshold. But I don't see that being at 10% when the R0 calculations that they're basing it on is including all of our lockdown measures and our physical distancing. That's the bit I'm worried about.
Okay, I'm going to move on to vaccines. Now. Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, obviously I'm hopeful, I've got my fingers crossed, but to say I'm 100% confident we'll get a vaccine this year, or indeed next year, is alas just an exaggeration. We're not there yet. Gabriela, are you saying we don't really need to get a vaccine?
The virus, I think there's consensus that the virus is not going to go away after this first encounter with the human population. So it's going to continue, and if the virus continues to cause severe disease to particular risk groups, the vaccine will still very useful and welcome. Perhaps not to put a break on the on the pandemic, on the first pandemic, for this first encounter with the virus, but for the future, if it becomes a seasonal virus and if it continues to be nasty for some risk groups, I think it will still be very useful.
And indeed, if it mutates as the common flu virus, cold viruses do. Gisli, what do you think? I mean, if herd immunity exists to the extent that Gabriela suggests, it maybe a vaccine isn't going to be the saviour.
Well, I don't think anything is likely to be a saviour. I think a vaccine is going to be extremely valuable regardless of the actual threshold of herd immunity. I think herd immunity is not the answer to everything, especially not if driven by active viral infection. So I think a vaccine is going to be very useful.
What about Boris's suggestion that we may not get it pretty soon? I think that's generally accepted, but we probably will get one in the end. Do you think one is pretty much likely to come along?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think it's more likely than vaccines against other coronaviruses which don't exist. I think it's generally agreed that given the effort that's been put into vaccine generation, that one will become available, but probably not for another 12 months, which means, unfortunately, that distancing and social change are going to be the norm for the next 12 months.
Or we haven't got a vaccine for SARS or for MERS, and I mean, SARS we're talking about 10, 12 years ago. I mean, David, do you think it could be that long in the future?
I don't really want to hazard a guess. I mean, what we are talking about now is at least 12 months away. And I would agree with Gisli entirely that we are looking at some sort of physical distancing and behavioral modification for that period. It could take that long. It could well be that the virus itself mutates to a point where it's no longer as harmful as the current version of it. But all of that's speculation, and we have to deal with the more immediate concern.
Would it take just one person anywhere, somewhere in the world to have the virus? In other words, you thought you'd eradicated it, but just one person still had it, for it to return to the extent that it has done now, if the checks and balances, vaccines, whatever, are not in place?
You'll notice nobody's jumping in to answer that one because, unfortunately, I think we're probably all in agreement that, yes, that's all it's going to take. If the story is right that this jump from the horseshoe bat to pangolin to humans very, very rapidly, and we saw this pandemic from that scenario, then it could happen all over again.
Goodness me. What do you think about herd immunity, Gabriela, as a means of containing it, perhaps eliminating it?
There will always be. So if we achieve herd immunity, the immunity will be waning, and you get new births. You have babies born without that immunity. So there will be some population turnover, and eventually the herd immunity, eventually you are below herd immunity again. So, and that's not for just this virus, it's just for all the other seasonal viruses. Even measles, before there was a measles vaccine, you'd have a measles epidemic every 3 years or so, because you have past herd immunity. That's why an epidemic stopped. But then 2 years later, there's no herd immunity anymore because new children were born without immunity. So that would continue to happen.
Gisli, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Gabriela's right. Herd immunity is something that a lot of people talk about, but it's not going to save the world from this horrible virus. Unfortunately, that comes down to physical distancing, finding a cure, and getting a vaccine, and that's the only things which are really going to make a huge difference at the current time.
Is it a fact that some people who've had COVID-19 don't have antibodies? And the reason I'm asking this question is because you develop vaccines to some extent from antibodies, and if some people don't have it, how effective could they be?
So we are seeing some cases of people who had proven COVID with nasal swabs at the time that 2 to 3 months later no longer or don't have immunoglobulins at the time. It's very difficult to be certain that they don't or couldn't produce antibodies if they were reinfected. It's entirely possible, and I stress possible, that they generated the immunoglobulins, their cells have become dormant, waiting to be reactivated if they are re-exposed. But similarly, we've seen in many other cases, such as SARS, where the immunoglobulins just disappeared after 18 months to 2 years. So it is entirely possible that every 2 years we're going to need a booster version of the vaccine.
Gabriela, we're coming towards the end of the program. It's been really interesting listening to what you have to say, and I'm going to ask Gisli, and if we have time, I'll ask David in just a moment what they make of your closing argument, if you like, because what I'm going to put to you is you're basing yours on simple mathematics, and modelling has shown to be very flawed in the 6 months that this virus has been around and attacking us. A lot of people might not believe what you have to say.
Well, we are not at the current, our ideas are not the current stream of modeling results. So most of the models were developed making these homogeneity assumptions that individuals are equally or almost equally susceptible and equally exposed. I think we added an extra degree of flexibility or a degree of freedom to these models to allow for individual variation, and we find and we explain why that it's intuitive that why that reduces the herd immunity threshold. I'd like to add here, I was the only one among the three of us who didn't say anything about social distancing. Our models include social distancing. And when we say herd immunity, we mean the percentage of the population that needs to be immune to prevent resurge of the epidemic after social distancing is lifted completely and we are back to normal. Okay. So, but it was absolutely essential to have social distancing to slow down the virus in its initial encounter with the population. Otherwise, the number of cases we would have seen would have been much larger, almost double the herd immunity threshold itself.
Gabriela, thank you. Gisli, what you've heard, interesting, no doubt, but if it is correct, is it a game changer?
I think we have to wait and see if it's correct. It would be great if it were correct. I'm not a mathematical modeler, and time will tell if it's correct. And if it is correct, it will be great. If it's not, then we have a lot of infection.
David, any way of testing whether the level of herd immunity is actually correct at 5, 10, 20, 60 or 65% is by exposing people either inadvertently or deliberately to the virus. So that isn't going to happen under this watch, is it?
No, I don't see that. And I, like Gisli, I do hope that Gabrielle is correct. However, if we've got a threshold for 20% in the UK and we are currently at 10%, that equates to another 45, 50,000 people dying before we get there. And that's with the physical distancing in place that isn't actually still being particularly well adhered to at the moment. So much as I'd love Gabrielle to be correct, I think we've got a long way to go.
But if she is it a big thing?
It still is going to have 50,000 more dead people and another few 100,000 people infected for it to take hold within the UK. So it's still not there yet.
Listen, much appreciated. Thank you very, very much indeed. Gabriela, you've put your theories to the test with two senior clinicians. I think they hope that you're right, but they don't quite know how it's going to work out or how easy it is going to be to prove it. Come back another time and tell us how it's gone. We appreciate it. David, thank you. Gabriela, Gisli, thank you very much for joining us on this round table. Gisli and David, for not the first time, thank you for hanging around, and thank you wherever you happen to be for watching this edition of Roundtable. We hope to have your company on another occasion. From me, David Foster, from the team that put it all together, goodbye for now.